In the entirety of Christian scripture, few images have proved as evocative as the four horsemen of the apocalypse from the book of Revelation. Frequently identified with division, war, famine, and death, the horsemen have featured prominently in art and culture in the many centuries since its authorship as the harbingers of doom in a book that offers a prophetic forecast of the end of the world. Revelation is also known as the Apocalypse of John, as apocalypse is Greek for unveiling. But, despite its place within the Christian canon today, it was one of the last books that the Church would accept as authoritative and divinely inspired. The first Christians were, of course, thoroughly convinced that the end of the world was soon at hand, meaning that Revelation was popular ever since its initial composition, near the end of the 1st century. However, it still faced a tough road into the official canon, because of not just the lingering doubts surrounding its authorship, but also owing to the overall strangeness of its content, and the difficulty of interpreting its cryptic critiques of Rome, which are heavily informed by the Jewish apocalyptic tradition, and result in dense symbology that is difficult to penetrate, as the previously mentioned four horsemen feature alongside dragons with multiple heads and grand beasts of obscure origins. Even in an age of profound religious innovation, and amongst a community that was expecting the world to end, Revelation remained a little too weird for some. But by the middle of the 3rd century, it would seem that the dire portrait that the author of Revelation had painted was actually underselling things, for the Roman world was riven by a crisis that bore all the hallmarks of the apocalypse he had foretold. The war and disorder of this period were eroding the very fabric of Roman life. But while many Romans were never directly threatened by civil war or invasion, none was safe from the famine and disease which were now touching every corner of the empire. Recent scholarship has highlighted how climactic shifts were resulting in a steady reduction of arable land, leading to chronic food shortages across the empire. But this was not simply a Roman problem, and the changing climate was one more destabilizing factor that contributed to the tribal incursions by groups outside Rome's borders. It was a perfect storm, with desperate tribes driven to raid the Roman frontier, creating opportunities for provincial commanders to launch their own violent bids for the throne that inevitably required an imperial response, which left critical regions undermanned and vulnerable to a new incursion. The multi-causality of this cycle made it incredibly difficult to address using the limited tools at the disposal of the imperial regimes, hence the incredibly high turnover of claimants in this volatile period. But, though war has been extensively covered, as we have an innate bias towards treating any crisis for which direct human agency can be attributed as more serious, another factor, indeed another horseman, posed the gravest danger of all. Disease and plague were running rampant throughout the empire, robbing it not just of countless lives, but of vitality and even hope. For in the great crucible of the 3rd century, disease would do more than any of these other factors to chip away at Roman self-conception and open the door to radical new modes of thought that would fundamentally transform the empire. Famine and war could claim lives, but disease could do much more. In addition to its grievous body count, plague and disease would make Romans doubt not just themselves, but their gods. The old world was dying in countless sickbeds across the empire, and a new creed was waiting to be born. If you're enjoying this video, please do us a favor by liking, commenting, and subscribing. We're a small channel, and this is the only way to get the almighty YouTube algorithm to notice us. Furthermore, you can help Tribunate become more sustainable by becoming a member for as little as 99 cents a month. Thank you for all of your support. But though disease would play the greatest part in kindling a reorientation of Roman belief which occurred during the 3rd century, we must remember that its impacts also depended on the confluence of factors mentioned earlier, notably the climactic shifts which resulted in higher infection rates and longer transmission seasons for the devastating and mysterious pandemic known today as the plague of Cyprian. The resulting scarcity of food also left many people malnourished, which rendered them more susceptible to infection and less able to fight off disease after it was contracted. Finally, the empire-wide economic and military connections that still prevailed in the Roman world ensured that no disease ever stayed isolated at its point of origin. The plague is named after Bishop Cyprian of Carthage, who provides our primary account of its symptoms and wider social impact, and it is clear that even in the midst of the plague, there was an awareness of its tight relationship with the other difficulties Rome was facing, phenomena that Cyprian and the Christians naturally interpreted as signs of the long-awaited Second Coming, and the end of the world. Thus, whatever is now born degenerates with the old age of the world itself, so that no one ought to wonder that everything begins to fail in the world, when the whole world itself is already in the process of failing, and in its end. Moreover, that wars continue frequently to prevail, that death and famine accumulate anxiety, that health is shattered by raging diseases, that the human race is wasted by the desolation of pestilence. Know that this was foretold, that evils should be multiplied in the last times, and that misfortunes should be varied, and that as the day of judgment is now drawing near, the censure of an indignant God should be more and more aroused for the scourging of the human race. Cyprian was wrong about the world ending, but in a strange way, he would end up being partially right. It wasn't the world that was ending, but a world was drawing to its close. The future did not hold the Armageddon of fire and brimstone that he and his flock felt was inevitable, but instead an actual apocalypse, an unveiling of the fragile base upon which traditional Roman religion stood, and a revelation of just how susceptible Rome now was to religious innovation. That this was a time of great religious uncertainty can be perceived in the growth of non-traditional religious practices during the 3rd century. Christianity is the obvious example, but its success was mirrored by dramatic growth in Gnostic and dualist creeds, as well as the cults of Isis and Mithra. The similarities of these cults with Christianity is easy to overstate, but it should be noted that these also oriented worship towards a particular deity, while removing traditional ambiguity regarding life after death, with the reassurance of a blissful afterlife for the faithful. In response, there was a growing push from the top to reinforce traditional practices, which were perceived as having lapsed and led to the current disorder. For example, we can remember the spiritual goals at the heart of Philip the Arab's Millennium Games, and those present in the efforts of Decius, the first emperor to embark on a universally applicable religious program. He bears the title Restorer of Cults and Liberty, hinting at how important this task was to him, but also providing confirmation that a perception existed that the cults needed restoration. For the authority of the gods and their position in society was in flux even before the remarkable growth of non-traditional religious practices. For decades now, there was a movement within Roman society towards a philosophical monotheism, which was reconciled with existing beliefs through the increased role of sun worship. There is a temptation then to paint traditional religion as on its last legs during the 3rd century, and rationalize the success of Christianity and other emerging creeds as a result of their doctrines aligning more closely with existing spiritual needs of a Roman Empire riven by conflict, death, and uncertainty. But we must recall that Christianity looks to us a more satisfying creed precisely because it was so successful, and it did reorient notions of what a religion should look like, and what it should offer adherents. Christian or not, we carry presuppositions informed by the dominance of this faith over the last 2,000 years, while a Roman in the 3rd century would have had the opposite outlook, with their ideas of religion shaped by their world, and what to them would have been the self-evident reality of polytheism. For these reasons, I find the popular idea of Christianity as a religion tailor-made to fit spiritual needs unsatisfying as an explanation for its growth in the 3rd century. Christianity may very well appeal to innate human desires for spiritual fulfillment in ways that traditional Roman religion did not. But in my view, this question is far too difficult to disentangle from our own perceptions of Christianity for it to be investigated with any historical certainty. At best, it can be posed as a hypothesis, one that conforms to the evidence available, but also one we aren't able to rigorously test ourselves. So while I am open to this as an explanation, the content of this video will instead focus on identifiable, material explanations for the rise of this creed. That is bound to leave some dissatisfied with the bifurcation of a question which certainly included spiritual desires and impulses as a significant rationale for conversion. But, at such a remove from the period in question, it's the only position I'm able to stake out with confidence. But rest assured, we still have evidence to stand on. Modern research shows that those who convert do not do so primarily because they find the doctrines of their new religion to be superior, but because of social ties and relationships with those adhering to the new faith. So, while of course it is dangerous to assume that modern rationale for conversion would be entirely consistent with how an ancient Roman would have approached such a weighty decision, this useful data point fits well with other evidence, and so I still regard the interpersonal relationships Christians built with the wider Roman world as the chief explanation for the exponential growth of the religion during this period. Instead of viewing the adoption of Christianity as a miraculous event without sociological explanation, the religion's astounding growth from approximately 200,000 individuals at the turn of the century to roughly 1 million by 250 and an estimated 6 million by 300, becomes intelligible if the church was able to maintain a steady growth rate, which calculations have shown never needed to rise above between 3 to 4% annually. Impressive? Yes, but not terribly implausible. These numbers only feel miraculous to us because at the remove of 1700 years, we compress the 3rd century into one artificial moment, without remembering that it, like all centuries, lasted 100 years. That is more than enough time for a religion to grow in prominence, one conversion at a time. But if its growth is explainable, questions can persist over why it was Christianity that took off instead of other religious trends that could be more easily reconciled with traditional practices. In my view, the plague of Cyprian here becomes central. A pandemic on this scale was always bound to produce some level of demographic disruption, just as the Antonine Plague had generations earlier. But, by the mid-3rd century, an alternative model of response to this disease was prominently on display in Roman cities. Christians confronted plague much differently than those who held to traditional religion, and nowhere was this more obvious than in the great cities of the empire, which were hotbeds of illness even in the best of times, but during the plague years were the sites of unimaginable suffering. Here is how Cyprian describes the plague that now bears his name. This trial, that now the bowels, relaxed into a constant flux, discharged the bodily strength, that a fire originated in the marrow ferments into wounds of the fauces, that the intestines are shaken with a continual vomiting, that the eyes are on fire with the injected blood, that in some cases the feet or some parts of the limbs are taken off by the contagion of diseased putrefaction, that, from the weakness arising by the maiming and loss of the body, either the gait is enfeebled, or the hearing is obstructed, or the sight darkened. While an accurate body count is impossible to calculate, we are told in the somewhat unreliable Historia Augusta that in just one day 5,000 died. This could be an exaggeration, but the death toll was immense, and none were safe. Now, alas, all is lamentation. Everyone in mourning, and the city resounds with weeping because of the numbers that have died and are dying every day. As Scripture says of the firstborn of the Egyptians, so now there has been a great cry. There is not a house in which there is not one dead. How I wish it had been only one. Even Hostilian, son of Decius, would die of the plague. Naturally, those who could left the city to stay in a country villa during the peak infection seasons. This followed established practice among those who were capable of decamping when disease was rampant. Even the great Dr. Galen, Rome's physician par excellence, would leave the city during the Antonine Plague, viewing the preservation of his own life as of higher importance than his medical responsibilities. The Emperor Trebonius Gallus even wins praise for not abandoning Rome during a flare-up of the plague, an indication of just how common this practice was. Those privileged enough to retreat to luxury estates were, of course, the wealthiest and best connected members of society, meaning that the civic and religious elite were likely absent entirely at a time when the populace would have been looking to them for reassurance. So, while priests of the traditional cults were not expected to act as counselors like modern religious figures, their absence from the city would ground traditional religious practice to a halt, as they alone were capable of performing the sacred rites to propitiate the gods. The sacramental and sacred rhythm of civic life was thus irrevocably disrupted, and even without the screams of the dying in the streets or the smell of rotting corpses wafting through the air, it would have seemed as if life had been sucked out of the city due to this cessation of bonds with the divine. This feeling of abandonment was compounded by the fact that Christians stayed in the city and devoted themselves to caring for the sick, even for non-Christians. Many viewed the suffering that was bound to occur due to close contact with the infected as a form of martyrdom and embraced the opportunity to serve the dying. What a grandeur of spirit it is to struggle with all the powers of an unshaken mind against so many onsets of devastation and death. What sublimity to stand erect amid the desolation of the human race, and not to lie prostrate with those who have no hope in God, but rather to rejoice and to embrace the benefit of the occasion, that, in thus bravely showing forth our faith, and by suffering endured, going forward to Christ by the narrow way that Christ trod, we may receive the reward of his life and faith according to his own judgment. Though by modern standards their understanding of the disease was limited and their resources meager, providing some rudimentary care would have resulted in increased survival rates among the Christians and those in their care, no matter how marginal. In the cosmology of the day, this would have seemed miraculous, for we must recall that in this era the existence of miracles was a universally accepted fact. Traditionally minded Romans did not believe that the Christian God did not exist. Rather, they felt they owed him no particular loyalty. Similarly, even the committed monotheist Christians and Jews did not treat the traditional pantheon as a figment of the imagination, but instead as real divine beings that existed and served the devil by stealing worship that rightfully belonged to the one true God. Such an openness to the miraculous and a lack of any other explanation would have produced many who felt they were healed through Christian prayer. Some of those were bound to convert. When the addition of these new faithful were combined with the already higher survival rate for existing Christians and the fact that the overall population of the empire was now significantly reduced, Christians naturally made up a higher share of the population after the plague dissipated than they had at its onset. This also helps explain why the Christian movement found such success in cities, to the extent that practitioners of traditional religion would soon bear the moniker paganus, or pagan, to denote their rural character. I have not used the term in this video, as it was never adopted by those it describes, and it also evokes an anachronistic view of traditional Roman religion as a structured and doctrinally consistent entity with strong internal coherence in the mold of modern monotheistic religions. Traditional religion would certainly move in this direction as it had to confront the challenge presented by Christianity, an effort that culminated with the Emperor Julian's attempt to create a codified framework for traditional religion. But this scheme died with him. The plague had provided a spur to Christian growth in urban areas, but the reality is that the new religion had always been stronger in cities than the countryside. This was also true of the mystery cults that early Christianity competed with, as it seems a hard and fast rule that there will be greater religious diversity in higher population density areas, since the concentration of people allows for the easier formation of a parallel community, and for this group to sustain itself by winning converts as members and by interfacing with broader social networks. From the beginning, Christian communities were characterized by internal cohesiveness, and the strong bonds of these early faithful congregations would have appealed to many, even if the vast majority showed no interest in the upstart faith. But at moments of tremendous disruption, such as in the wake of plague, famine, or war, those who had been socially uprooted or had lost their immediate family may have sought out the comfort and solace of a group that had a reputation for inclusivity. This reputation had been earned through the church practice of almsgiving in support of widows, orphans, and other socially vulnerable members that dated back to the first Christian communities. It is important to stress that this was not unique to the Christians. After all, the precedents for it were found within Judaism, and the lowest rungs of Roman society still depended on the vast alimenta programs that are compared to a modern welfare state, but in reality were quite religious in nature. However, Christians earned particular praise for their mutual aid, meaning in addition to social belonging, the church was able to offer material stability in the here and now, which, for many, would have trumped assurances of a blissful afterlife. After all, that promise could be found elsewhere. The critical difference then is not the presence of specific doctrines, but how Christians expressed them in their daily lives. Christian doctrine spoke of an eternal union with God, but it also demanded universal brotherhood on earth and the care of the least and the lost. That this call was embraced and treated as a religious obligation caused the Christians to gain a unique reputation, and despite their status as peculiar religious outsiders, Roman society tended to have a positive opinion of them. Persecutions and pogroms did occur, but these were sporadic, and in each persecution we hear tales of Christians being protected by those outside their community, and of local authorities doing all they can to dilute enforcement of regressive imperial edicts. We go too far when we divide all of Roman society into two dogmatic camps, when the reality is that for the most part Christians were not viewed as a threat to Rome, but rather as neighbors, colleagues, and friends. Nor were the Christians of this time exclusively composed of the downcast and downtrodden wretches of popular imagination. There were Christians at the highest echelons of Roman society, and their peculiar faith was tolerated by their peers, even if never quite understood. The two worlds were much more interwoven than we tend to think, something that can be seen in how frequently interfaith marriages occurred, in part because there were typically more Christian women than Christian men. That Christianity had weathered initial opposition and become a well-established part of the Roman social fabric in the roughly 150 years since its founding left it poised for success. All it needed was a push. That moment arrived during the crisis period, with the most critical single event being the plague of Cyprian. The devastation of this pandemic was fatal to a religious system that was already starting to fray and veer towards mysticism and monotheism. It took centuries for this tradition to fade away entirely, but its sense of self-assurance was gone, and it could never again command the natural loyalty it once had. But, like nature, humanity abhors a vacuum, and the meteoric rise of new modes of thought was an inevitable result of the inability of Rome's existing religious framework to provide many of its citizens with an acceptable or even intelligible lens through which to process the plague and Rome's perpetual crisis. Something new was demanded, and Christian activity during the plague endeared the community to enough Romans that the movement was able to grow in the wake of a disaster that had ripped the heart out of the Roman world. The Christian writer Tertullian famously said, "The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church." In a way, he was right. However, it was not the small number of martyrs thrown to lions who would win the most converts, but the thousands of martyrs who stayed behind to tend to the sick year after year, as the plague claimed hundreds of thousands of lives over the course of nearly 2 decades. There is a lesson for all of us here, because while it's easy to imagine oneself making a heroic ultimate sacrifice, defying the powers that be and dying for what one believes in, becoming a symbol that millions will one day rally around, it's harder to put oneself in a position of doing the anonymous and unseen work of lifting others up. Maybe the real miracle is that so many were willing to risk their lives doing this unglamorous work. That this is what changes the world is a revelation.